The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street outside the Dragon's Blood headquarters when Kimberly Francis clutched her crumpled $5 bill and made a decision that would change everything. She was 9 years old. She had $5. Her mother needed $60,000. The math was impossible, but desperation doesn't calculate odds. "Please," she whispered to herself, her small fingers tightening around the worn bill. "Please let him help." The men lounging outside the building noticed her immediately. A little black girl in a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, her hair twisted into small knots, walking with purpose toward the most dangerous organization in the city. One of them straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his phone. Another cursed under his breath and started forward. But then Sang-tae emerged from the entrance. The Dragon's Blood boss was a figure carved from reputation and fear. Slicked back hair, a leather vest that revealed intricate tattoos winding down his arms like living serpents, an earring catching the light as he moved. Men who'd spent years in the underworld instinctively stepped aside when he walked. His presence didn't announce itself. It simply was, the way a storm doesn't ask permission to arrive. Kimberly stopped 3 feet away from him. The associates froze. This was wrong on every level. Children didn't approach Sang-tae. Civilians didn't approach Sang-tae. The desperate, the foolish, the suicidal. They might try, but a 9-year-old girl holding what looked like lunch money? "Boss," one of his lieutenants started, moving to intercept. Sang-tae raised one tattooed hand, silencing him without a word. His dark eyes settled on Kimberly, and for a moment, the street itself seemed to hold its breath. She met his gaze with the kind of courage that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "Will you save my mother's life?" she asked, her voice small but steady as she held out the $5 bill. "This is all I have." The question hung in the air like smoke. Behind Sang-tae, his chief enforcer, a man called Viper who'd broken bones for looking at the boss wrong, went completely still. The other associates exchanged glances that mixed confusion with something approaching awe. In 15 years of Dragon's Blood operations, through territory wars and federal investigations and blood feuds that left bodies in the harbor, nothing had ever made Sang-tae's expression change the way it did in that moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes, usually cold and calculating as a predator's, flickered with something that might have been recognition. Not of the girl, but of the impossible position she was in. Sang-tae looked at the $5 bill, then back at Kimberly's face, reading the story written in her desperate eyes. The dying mother, the medical bills that might as well be a mountain, the countdown clock that never stops ticking, the little girl who'd walked into a dragon's den because she had nowhere else left to go. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd ordered executions with the same calm tone. "What does your mother need?" And Kimberly Francis, 9 years old and out of options, began to explain how her world was ending, and how a man named Dennis, her mother's cousin, had offered to make it all go away for a price that was even more impossible than $60,000. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you the way they move me, make sure you subscribe. It helps these stories continue, and it tells me you want more. Kimberly's words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like she'd been holding them back for too long. Her mother had stage 4 cancer, the kind where doctors stopped talking about survival rates and started talking about making her comfortable. But there was a clinical trial, an experimental treatment at University Hospital, something with modified cells that attacked tumors the way her mother's body couldn't anymore. The doctors said she was a perfect candidate. They said it could work. They also said it cost $60,000 up front. Sang-tae listened without interrupting, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. Behind him, Viper had pulled out his phone, already running searches. The other associates formed an unconscious perimeter, as if shielding this moment from the rest of the world. "We don't have insurance that covers it," Kimberly continued, her grip on the $5 bill tightening until her knuckles went pale. "Mama worked 2 jobs, but she got sick and lost both of them. We were going to lose our apartment, but then Cousin Dennis said he could help." The way she said his name, Cousin Dennis, carried a weight that made Sang-tae's eyes narrow. "He's a social worker," Kimberly explained, and now her voice got smaller, quieter, like speaking the words out loud made them more real. "He said he could get the money. He has money. But he said," she swallowed hard, "he said I'd have to come live with him. Permanently. He'd file papers, make it legal, say Mama was unfit because of the cancer. He showed me the custody documents. Already filled out." Sang-tae's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. A coldness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the sudden, absolute understanding of what he was hearing. He said once the papers were signed, he'd pay for everything, Kimberly continued. All 60,000. But Mama would have to give me up forever. Even if she got better. Her voice cracked. He said I should think of it like a trade. My life for hers. Viper looked up from his phone, his jaw clenched so tight his temples pulsed. One of the younger associates actually turned away, his hand pressed against the building's brick wall. Sang-tae finally moved, lowering himself down onto one knee so his eyes were level with Kimberly's. Up close, she could see the details of his tattoos. Dragons and flames and symbols in languages she didn't recognize, and the scars that interrupted them. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. The faint, desperate flutter of hope. This Dennis, Sang-tae said, his voice carrying the quiet precision of a blade being drawn from its sheath. He touched you. No, Kimberly said quickly. But the way he looks at me. She trailed off, and that unfinished sentence said everything. Sang-tae held her gaze for a long moment, and in his dark eyes, Kimberly saw something that made her breath catch. Not danger directed at her, but a cold, calculating fury that promised someone was about to learn exactly what happened when you mistook cruelty for cleverness. Give me his full name, Sang-tae said. If you're still here, thank you, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the rest of stories like this. Sang-tae stayed on one knee, his tattooed arm extending toward Kimberly in a gesture that seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. The dragon inked across his forearm appeared to coil protectively, its scales catching the afternoon light. For a moment, the street corner transformed into something else entirely. Not a meeting between a crime lord and a desperate child, but a night before someone who needed defending. Kimberly's hand trembled as she held out the $5 bill again, pushing it toward him with the insistence of someone offering their last possession to save the world. Please, she whispered. It's all I have, but maybe you could. Sang-tae's hand moved with surprising gentleness, his fingers closing around her small fist. Not taking the money, but folding her fingers back over it. Keep it, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're going to need it for something sweet after this is over. Ice cream, maybe. Whatever 9-year-olds buy with $5. Kimberly's eyes filled with tears, confusion, and hope warring across her face. But I have to pay you something. Mama always said nothing's free, that people don't help unless. Your mama's right about most people, Sang-tae interrupted, still holding her fist closed around the bill. But today you found different people. He released her hand and stood, his presence shifting from gentle to commanding in a single fluid motion. The transformation was startling. One moment he was kneeling before a child, the next he was the dragon's blood boss again, a man whose word could move mountains or bury bodies. Viper, he said without looking back, his eyes still on Kimberly's face as if memorizing every detail of this moment. His chief enforcer stepped forward immediately. Viper was a wall of muscle and scars, the kind of man who'd made grown men weep just by entering a room. But when he looked down at Kimberly, something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Take her to the Garden District safe house, Sang-tae ordered. The one with the kitchen that Mrs. Chin set up. Make sure she eats. Make sure she's comfortable. And Viper, he paused, his tone dropping into something that carried the weight of absolute authority. Nobody touches her. Nobody even looks at her wrong. She's under Dragon's blood protection now. Spread the word through every channel we have. Yes, boss. Viper's response was immediate, reverent. Sang-tae turned back to Kimberly, and for just a second, his expression gentled again. We're going to fix this, he said with the certainty of a man who'd never failed at anything he'd truly committed to. Your mother's going to get her treatment. And Dennis, the name came out like poison. Dennis is going to learn what happens when someone mistakes a little girl's desperation for opportunity. Behind him, the other associates were already moving, phones emerging from pockets, quiet conversations beginning. The Dragon's Blood Syndicate was mobilizing, and somewhere across the city, Dennis had no idea that his world was about to end. Take a breath, and if you haven't already, subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive. The war room in the Dragon's Blood headquarters was a place where empires were planned and enemies were erased. Sang-tae sat at the head of a black lacquered table, his fingers steepled as 3 of his top lieutenants fed him information with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Dennis Wakefield, 42, said Jean, the syndicate's intelligence officer, his laptop screen reflecting in his glasses. Social worker for the Department of Children and Family Services for 8 years. Clean record on paper. But paper lies. How deep did you dig? Sang-tae asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man asking about the weather, not the systematic destruction of someone's life. Deep enough to find the bodies, Jean replied, pulling up a series of documents. 3 separate complaints filed against him over the past 5 years. All buried, all settled quietly out of department channels. 2 were allegations of inappropriate conduct with children in his care. 1 was a foster mother who claimed he coerced her into signing custody transfer documents under duress. Sang-tae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Settlements. Cash payments, NDAs, the works, confirmed Razor, the syndicate's financial tracker. A thin man with sharp eyes who could trace dirty money through a dozen shell companies before breakfast. He paid out of pocket, $35,000 to one family, $20,000 to another. For a social worker making $62,000 a year, that's interesting mathematics. Inheritance, Jean interjected. His parents died 6 years ago, left him close to $400,000. He's been burning through it systematically. Current liquid assets estimate around $73,000, which means he has the $60,000 for Kimberly's mother, Sang-tae finished, his voice dropping into something cold and lethal. He's not offering charity. He's purchasing a child. The room went silent for a beat. Even these men, who'd witnessed and committed acts that would make ordinary people recoil, felt something dark settle over the conversation. There's more, Jean continued, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. I pulled his case files through our contact at DCFS. Over the past 8 years, Dennis has handled 47 child welfare cases. 23 of those resulted in custody transfers. Of those 23, 11 went to foster situations that were later flagged for investigation. Financial exploitation, inappropriate living conditions, 1 case of documented abuse. He's not just a predator, Sang-tae said quietly, standing from his chair and walking to the window that overlooked the city. He's a trafficker. He uses his position to move vulnerable children into situations he controls or profits from. Viper entered the room, his expression grim. The girl's secure. She ate. She's asking about her mother. Sang-tae turned from the window, and in his eyes was something his lieutenants had seen before. Usually right before someone disappeared permanently. Jean, I want every piece of evidence you can compile. Every complaint, every settlement, every questionable case. Razor, trace his money. I want to know every account, every asset, every place he's hidden his sins. And Dennis himself? Viper asked. Sang-tae smiled, and it was the smile of a dragon before it breathed fire. Find him. Bring him to me. It's time Mr. Wakefield learned the difference between the system's justice and ours. If this chapter touched something in you, tap subscribe. There's so much more ahead. They found Dennis Wakefield in the parking garage beneath his apartment complex at 9:47 p.m., briefcase in hand, tie loosened after what he probably thought was just another Tuesday. He didn't notice the black SUVs until they'd already blocked both exits, and by then, it was far too late for anything except consequences. Sang-tae emerged from the center vehicle with Viper and 4 others, their footsteps echoing in the concrete space like a countdown. Dennis froze halfway to his sedan, his hand hovering near his pocket where his phone lived, his brain finally catching up to what his instincts had been screaming. Dennis Wakefield, Sang-tae said, his voice calm and almost conversational as he approached. We need to discuss your business proposal to a 9-year-old girl. Dennis's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, fear, and then, remarkably, indignation. He straightened his shoulders, clutching his briefcase like a shield. I don't know who you are, but I'm a city employee. A social worker. Whatever you think you're doing, I suggest you. Suggest. Sang-tae interrupted, stopping 10 feet away. His tattooed arms were crossed, his expression almost curious. You're going to suggest things to me? That's bold. I have legal authority over Kimberly Francis, Dennis said, his voice gaining false confidence as he fell back on the bureaucratic armor he'd worn for years. Her mother is terminally ill and unable to provide adequate care. I've already initiated custody proceedings through proper channels. The paperwork is filed with the court. You can't just. Viper moved before Dennis could finish, closing the distance in 2 strides and plucking the briefcase from his hands as easily as taking candy from an actual child. Dennis started to protest, but the words died when he saw the look in Viper's eyes. The paperwork, Sangtae said softly, gesturing for Viper to open the briefcase. Inside were the custody documents, pre-signed by Dennis, waiting only for a desperate mother's signature. Tell me, Dennis, is it standard procedure to offer $60,000 in exchange for permanent custody? Is that in the DCFS handbook? That's a private family arrangement, Dennis stammered, but his voice had lost its certainty. I'm trying to help. The girl needs stability, and her mother needs. Her mother needs cancer treatment, Sangtae interrupted, his voice dropping to something arctic. And you, Dennis, need a 9-year-old girl badly enough to trade $60,000 for her. That's not help. That's not family arrangement. That's purchase. Dennis's face flushed. You don't understand the complexity of child welfare. I have legal standing. I'm her blood relative. Any judge will. Any judge will what? Sangtae asked, pulling a manila folder from inside his jacket. Will they ignore the 3 previous complaints? The settlements you paid? The pattern of questionable custody transfers. He tossed the folder at Dennis's feet. We know everything, Dennis. Every family you paid off. Every child you moved. Every sin you thought you buried. Dennis looked down at the scattered documents, and his face went the color of old concrete. When he looked back up, the bureaucratic shield was gone, replaced by raw, naked fear. What do you want? He whispered. Sangtae smiled, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. I want you to listen very carefully to what happens next. Before we move on, a small favor. Subscribe if you're enjoying the journey so far. Sangtae crouched down, picking up one of the documents that had spilled from the folder, holding it up so Dennis could see it clearly in the garage's fluorescent lighting. It was a bank statement with multiple highlighted transactions, each one corresponding to a date that Dennis undoubtedly remembered with perfect, damning clarity. $35,000 to the Morrison family, Sangtae said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Paid 3 days after they filed a complaint alleging you touched their daughter during a home visit. The complaint disappeared. The Morrisons moved to Nevada. You kept your job. He dropped that page and picked up another. $20,000 to the Chin family. Their son reported that you told him his disabled mother would lose custody unless he cooperated with your special assessments. That complaint also vanished. Another page. $15,000 to Sandra Beckworth, foster mother, who claimed you falsified case notes to justify removing children from stable homes and placing them in situations where you received kickbacks. Dennis's breathing had gone shallow, his eyes darting between the documents and the exit he couldn't reach. Those were settlements. Legal settlements. You can't. We can, Sangtae interrupted, standing to his full height. Because unlike you, Dennis, we don't hide behind paperwork and bureaucracy. We exist in the shadows, which means we understand how shadows work. He gestured to Viper, who produced another folder, this one thicker. These are copies, Sangtae continued. The originals are with 5 different people right now. A prosecutor who owes us a favor. A journalist who specializes in institutional corruption. A federal investigator looking to make her career. A family court judge who takes child welfare very seriously. And a police detective who has a daughter exactly Kimberly's age. Dennis's legs seemed to give out slightly. He caught himself against his car, his briefcase falling to the concrete with a hollow thud. Here's what happens next, Sangtae said, his voice dropping into something that carried the absolute weight of inevitability. You're going to withdraw every custody filing related to Kimberly Francis. Tonight, you're going to write a letter stating you are permanently relinquishing any claim to her care due to personal circumstances. You're going to resign from DCFS, effective immediately. And then, Dennis, you're going to disappear. Disappear? Dennis whispered. Leave the city. Leave the state. We don't care where you go, but you go far and you stay gone. Sangtae leaned forward slightly. Because if you so much as think about contesting this, every document in these folders gets delivered simultaneously. Your career ends. Your freedom ends. And given what you've done to children, Dennis, prison will be very educational for you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Dennis understood perfectly. Child predators didn't fare well behind bars, and everyone in that garage knew it. You have 48 hours, Sangtae said, straightening. After that, we start making phone calls. Dennis grabbed his briefcase with shaking hands, stumbling toward his car. He dropped his keys twice before getting the door open. As he drove away, tires squealing, Viper watched him go with cold satisfaction. Think he'll run? Viper asked. Sang-tae smiled darkly. He's already running. He just doesn't know he'll never stop. Still with me? Then hit subscribe. It means more than you know. The Dragon's Blood Financial Operations Center was hidden behind a legitimate import-export business on the waterfront. 3 floors of computers and encrypted communications where the syndicate's money moved through channels that would take federal investigators years to untangle. Sang-tae walked in at midnight, and every person in the room immediately stopped what they were doing. "I need $60,000, he announced without preamble. "Clean money, traceable to legitimate sources. And I need it by sunrise." His chief accountant, a woman called Numbers who'd once embezzled $3 million from a casino without leaving a single digital footprint, looked up from her terminal with raised eyebrows. "Boss, we've got $60,000 in petty cash. You want me to?" "No," Sang-tae interrupted, moving to the center of the room where a large display showed the syndicate's various holdings and cash flows in real time. "Not syndicate money. It needs to be clean enough to go directly to University Hospital for a medical treatment. No questions, no flags, no federal attention." Understanding rippled through the room. This wasn't about business. This was about something else entirely. Numbers pulled up a different screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We've got funds in the legitimate businesses. The restaurant group has $42,000 in operating capital. The construction company has another $35,000 in their accounts. The shipping business. Liquidate what we need from those sources," Sang-tae ordered. "And I want every high-value debt called in tonight. Everyone who owes Dragon's Blood money, everyone we've protected, everyone who's benefited from our arrangement, they pay now." Razor entered the room, tablet in hand, already pulling up accounts. "Boss, we've got outstanding debts totaling close to $200,000. The nightclub owner on 5th Street owes us $18,000. The real estate developer in the Diamond District owes $25,000. All of them," Sang-tae said flatly. "I don't care if it's inconvenient. I don't care if they need time. They have until 6 a.m. to deliver cash or verified transfers. Anyone who refuses gets visited by Viper." The room burst into controlled chaos, phones emerging, calls being made, texts being sent. The Dragon's Blood network activated like a sleeping beast opening its eyes. Across the city, people who thought they had days or weeks to settle their obligations suddenly received urgent messages. Pay now, or face immediate consequences. Numbers worked 3 keyboards simultaneously, transferring funds from shell companies, consolidating accounts, routing money through legitimate channels until it emerged clean on the other side. "We're at 47,000, she called out after 20 minutes. "Another 13 and we're there." "The poker game," Viper said, entering the room with his phone pressed to his ear. "The high-stakes game we run on Thursdays. They're in session now. I can pull 15,000 from tonight's house take." Sang-tae nodded. "Do it, boss," Numbers said quietly, looking up from her screens. "This is a lot of heat for one civilian. A lot of resources for—" "We save the mother," Sang-tae interrupted, his voice carrying absolute finality. "That's the objective. That's the only objective. Make it happen." Numbers met his eyes for a long moment, then smiled slightly and returned to her keyboards. "Yes, boss. We save the mother. If your heart is following this story, let it guide your finger to the subscribe button." The sun broke over the city skyline at 6:43 a.m., painting the waterfront in shades of amber and gold, and Numbers looked up from her terminal with exhausted triumph in her eyes. $62,000 for $118, she announced. "All clean, all traceable to legitimate business income and charitable donations from various anonymous donors." Sang-tae, who hadn't slept, hadn't even sat down during the entire night's operation, allowed himself a single nod. "Transfer it." The money moved through channels that would satisfy even the most suspicious hospital administrator. A construction company's community outreach fund, a restaurant group's employee assistance program, donations from 3 separate small business owners grateful for the city's economic recovery. By 7:15 a.m., University Hospital's billing department received confirmation of a $60,000 payment for the experimental cancer treatment of one Diane Francis, along with instructions that any remaining funds should be allocated to her ongoing care. Dr. Sarah Chun, the oncologist overseeing the clinical trial, arrived at her office to find the confirmation waiting in her inbox. She stared at it for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. 2 days ago, she'd had to tell a terrified 9-year-old girl that without payment, her mother couldn't be accepted into the program. Now, somehow, impossibly, the full amount had materialized overnight. She didn't question it. She'd been a doctor long enough to recognize a miracle when she saw one, regardless of its source. By 9:30 a.m., Diane Francis had been admitted, prepped, and was receiving her first round of the modified cell therapy. The treatment would take weeks to show results, but the doctors were optimistic. Her tumor markers were responding well to the preliminary protocols, and she was stronger than her charts suggested. Sangtae received the update via encrypted message at 10:47 a.m. Package delivered. Recipient stable. Treatment initiated. No complications. He was in his office at Dragon's Blood headquarters. The morning sun streaming through windows that overlooked territory he'd fought to control for 15 years. Viper stood nearby, waiting. "The girl?" Sangtae asked. "Still at the safe house." Mrs. Chen made her breakfast, eggs, toast, orange juice. She ate. "She's asking when she can see her mother." "Arrange it," Sangtae said quietly. "This afternoon. Hospital visitation. Make sure she has something nice to wear. A child shouldn't visit her mother looking like." He trailed off, and Viper understood. Looking desperate. Looking scared. Looking like she'd walked into a crime lord's territory with $5 and a prayer. "Already handled, boss." Mrs. Chen took her shopping this morning. New clothes, new shoes. Viper paused. The girl cried. Happy crying. Sangtae turned back to the window, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. Somewhere in this city, Dennis Wakefield was packing his belongings in terror. Somewhere else, a mother was receiving treatment that would save her life. And in a safe house across town, a 9-year-old girl was crying happy tears for the first time in months. Good, Sangtae said softly. That's good. Stories like this take time to craft. If you want more, subscribe. I'd love to keep making them for you. Mrs. Eleanor Martinez had been a teacher for 37 years before retirement, and in that time she'd seen every kind of child walk through her classroom doors. The bright ones, the struggling ones, the traumatized ones who carried scars that textbooks couldn't heal. When Sangtae called and asked if she'd taken a 9-year-old girl for a few months, she didn't ask questions. She'd known him since he was 16, had taught him literature, and helped him get his GED after the streets had claimed his formal education. She knew what he was now, what he'd become, but she also knew that when Sangtae asked for something, it mattered. Kimberly moved into Mrs. Martinez's modest home in the Garden District 3 days after her mother's treatment began. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books, and there was a bedroom with yellow walls and a window that looked out onto a garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, and safety was a luxury Kimberly had almost forgotten existed. You can visit your mama every day after school, Mrs. Martinez said, helping Kimberly unpack the new clothes Mrs. Chen had bought. I'll drive you myself, and we'll stay as long as the nurses allow. Kimberly nodded, carefully folding a shirt, then looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her face. Why is Mr. Sang doing this? He doesn't even know us. Mrs. Martinez sat down on the bed, considering her answer carefully. Sometimes, she said slowly, people with hard lives understand what it means when someone needs help. And sometimes the people everyone thinks are monsters are the only ones brave enough to fight other monsters. That afternoon, Sangtae visited the hospital for the first time. He went alone, without Viper, without the entourage that usually surrounded him, wearing a simple black shirt that covered most of his tattoos. He'd never been comfortable in hospitals. Too many memories of injuries that should have killed him. Too many friends who died in rooms like these. Diane Francis was awake when he entered, propped up on pillows, and 4-line running into her arm delivering the modified cells that were already attacking her tumors with programmed precision. She looked fragile, diminished by illness and fear, but her eyes were alert. And when she saw him, when she recognized the tattooed arm that Kimberly must have described, those eyes filled with tears. You're him, she whispered. Sangtae stopped at the foot of her bed, suddenly uncertain in a way he never was when facing armed enemies or federal investigators. Yes, ma'am. My baby told me what you did. What you're doing. Diane's voice broke. She said you took her $5 and made miracles happen. I didn't take the money, Sangtae said quietly. She still has it. A tear rolled down Diane's cheek, then another. She reached out one trembling hand toward him, and after a moment's hesitation, he moved closer, letting her grasp his fingers with strength that surprised him. Thank you, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a mother's desperate gratitude. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for protecting my daughter. Thank you for. Her voice failed, overcome, but she didn't need to finish. Sang-tae understood. He squeezed her hand gently, this woman who'd raised a child brave enough to walk into hell with $5, and nodded once. Get well, he said. Your daughter's waiting for you. One more chapter to go. Before we finish, subscribe so you're here when the next story drops. 2 months later, Dr. Chin stood in Diane Frances's hospital room with test results that made her smile despite her professional composure. The tumors are gone, she said simply. All of them. The treatment worked better than we projected. You're cancer-free. Diane collapsed into tears, and Kimberly, who'd been holding her mother's hand during the appointment, buried her face in her mother's shoulder and sobbed with relief that seemed to shake her entire small body. They'd been living in fear for so long that freedom from it felt almost unreal, like waking from a nightmare to discover the morning sun. The day Diane was discharged, Sang-tae wasn't there. He'd kept his distance during her recovery, visiting only twice more, always brief, always quietly checking that mother and daughter had everything they needed. But 3 days after Diane returned to a new apartment, one that appeared in her name with a year's rent mysteriously prepaid, a package arrived at Dragon's Blood headquarters. Inside was the $5 bill, pressed flat and accompanied by a note in a child's careful handwriting. Thank you for teaching me that $5 can change the world when the right person holds it. Love, Kimberly. Sang-tae held the bill for a long time, studying the creases where small fingers had clutched it desperately, the worn edges that spoke of being carried as a last hope. Then he called his top lieutenants to his private office, Viper, Jean, Numbers, Razor, and 3 others who formed the inner circle of Dragon's Blood. They arrived to find him standing before a simple black frame mounted on the wall behind his desk. Inside, pressed between glass, was Kimberly's $5 bill. 2 months ago, Sang-tae began without preamble. A 9-year-old girl walked into our world with this. She had nothing else, no connections, no leverage, no power. Just desperate love for her mother, and the courage to ask for help in the one place everyone told her was too dangerous to go. His lieutenants stood in silence, understanding this was more than a story. This was something being written into the foundation of what they were. We are criminals, Sang-tae continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. We break laws. We hurt people who deserve it, and sometimes people who don't. We exist in shadows because the light would destroy us. But that $5 bill, he gestured to the frame, represents something the system couldn't provide. When bureaucracy failed, when predators circled, when legal channels became weapons against the innocent, we stepped in. We did what needed doing. He turned to face them fully. This is Dragon's Blood's truest power. Not the territory we control. Not the money we move. Not the fear we inspire. Our darkest power is this. We can protect the utterly helpless when no one else will. We can be monsters who hunt monsters. And sometimes that's the only justice that exists. Viper nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. A new code. Not new, Sang-tae corrected. Just clearer. The $5 code. When someone comes to us with nothing but desperate need and pure heart, we answer. Always. The lieutenants absorbed this in silence, each of them touched by something they'd thought their lives had burned away years ago. The memory of what it felt like to be powerless, to need help that wouldn't come, to face impossible odds alone. Kimberly's story stays internal, Sang-tae said. The world doesn't need to know. But we remember. Every one of us. Because the day we forget what that $5 bill means is the day we become the predators we hunt. Numbers spoke quietly. The girl, will we see her again? Sang-tae smiled, something genuine and almost soft. She's 9 years old with a healthy mother and a safe home. If we've done our job right, she'll never need to see us again. He looked back at the framed bill, and in the glass's reflection, he saw not the crime lord he'd become, but the desperate kid he'd once been. The one who'd needed help that never came, who'd learned to survive in shadows because the light had no place for him. But she'll remember, he said softly. And so will we. The $5 bill remained on his wall, a reminder that power without purpose was just violence, and that sometimes the most important wars were fought not for territory or profit, but for a 9-year-old girl who believed that $5 could buy a miracle. She'd been right. It could, if the right monsters were listening. If this story stayed with you, let's stay connected. Hit subscribe.